Good morning. Good morning. If you're live, it's morning. But whatever time of day you're watching this, it's it's about 7:30 in the morning where I am in the great state of Maine, and the sun is just about up. So rise, I'm looking out into the trees, which it's all oaks behind me, so there's no leaves right now. They're covered with snow, and the sun is coming up. And the good morning, nice to see you as always. So the sun's coming up, and it's just really, really beautiful. And I always like to take a moment to pause and just try to connect with nature, be grateful for the fact that it exists, and that recognize our interconnection with that. So it's a beautiful morning. I'm drinking not out of my mug, out of somebody else's mug. It's this Stay Wild Moonchild, and it's got I guess sort of a Ouija board looking design on it with suns and moons and stuff. Kind of mystical. I dig it. I'm into it. I'm cool with it. And this morning we're going to talk about the shadow. And I've done a lot of videos about the shadow. I've done a lot live, at least one about the shadow. And I'm going to talk about it probably a lot more in the future. It's a really important topic to me. So I'll get into it a little bit. And because I've done so much work on so much, video and writing and all of this about the shadow, I'm just going to touch briefly on things like what the shadow is, where it comes from. But I think that's important if you've never watched it, if you haven't watched any of my other videos in the shadow, or you don't have a background in it to kind of get an understanding of what we're talking about today. But the topic for today is seeing your shadow self as an ally. Now, this to me is a really important paradigm shift for many people on their spiritual path, to understand that the parts of us that we don't like, or that we exile, or that we force into the shadow, or that remain hidden, those parts and the shadow itself as a complex of things is actually an ally of ours. It can be difficult to see that because some of the things that happen with the shadows, it can make us more reactive. It can make us lose our temper. It can make us think our secret desires are shameful. It can reinforce this shame complex that a lot of people have. um, but it is an ally. I'll explain that. I'll talk about that. I'll talk about triggers. I'll talk about wounding. I'll talk about secret desires, projection, all of this stuff, right? And the sort of the function of the shadow, and why it can be a really powerful ally in our spiritual quest. And a really important part of spiritual development is addressing, becoming aware of, embracing your shadow self. It's a really important part of self-love and self-acceptance, which are critical to spiritual development, right? You can do all of this spiritual work, but in the end, if you don't have love and acceptance for yourself, you're really not going to get very far, right? And I don't know how we measure spiritual development, but for myself, I know that I see things progress, and there are indicators kind of along the way that, oh, I don't have symptoms of my PTSD anymore, and I'm able to help more people and reach out to more people, and more people are attracted into my life who um, seem to be in alignment with my te- my teachings, not just the things I teach, but the things that were taught to me, etc. So that you know, these are sort of markers for me of spiritual development. But another marker is really integration of the self, the all the different parts of ourselves. Humans are very, very complex. And it's kind of funny because it's like I have pets, which may or may not make an appearance. My cat likes to jump into the video frequently, um, but they, animals don't have a sense of shame like humans do, right? They lick themselves in the middle of the living room floor, and whatever. And people talk about dog shaming. Dogs are very social, and so are cats, but dogs aren't really feeling shame in the same way people are. So it's interesting. So, first question: does your shadow have much to do with your ego? Yes. Like, does the ego ever use your shadow? Um, that's an interesting question. So yes, shadow has a lot to do with ego. So this is a good opportunity for me, and I'm going to answer your question, I promise. Um, but for those who are not as familiar with the shadow, I'm going to just talk about it really briefly, and then I'm going to talk about why the sort of the ego's relationship to the shadow. Um, so the shadow is a term coined by Carl Jung, the psychoanalyst, contemporary of Freud, but also very shamanic, very spiritual. He had really powerful spiritual awakening, learned a lot through about shamanism, and sort of he, developed lots of words that we use today, like archetype, the and the shadow. Not that the shadow existed as an English word before then, but the way his definition of the shadow. So he defined the shadow as sort of our exiled parts. The parts, it's a complex of our parts that we have hidden away. And why do we hide them away? One, they are painful to have in our consciousness. So could be anything like old trauma, psychological, psycho-spiritual wounds. And in this aspect, there's drawing a distinct line between psychology and spirit, between mind and spirit, is impossible. You can't draw a clean line there. They're very much um, overlapping, interpenetrating. Um, Mind, body, and spirit are basically a continuum of things that all interact. So the shadow, or the parts of ourselves that are too painful for us to be in our normal consciousness, so we hide them away. And they include any, things. The shadow forms generally as a result of our upbringing, so our parenting or family units, our the culture that we live in, the education that we get, the other relationships in our life, and some amount of self-reflection as well. So, for example, um, there's a lot of, growing up in the culture that I did, there was a lot of shame about sexuality, or, um, particularly growing up, in the age where I grew up in, things like being gay could get you killed for sure, right? In fact, it happened. And so a lot of people were closeted, but also closeted to themselves, right? They tried to hide away parts of that, but it would the issue with the shadow is these parts are always trying to resurface because they're protective. And this I'll get into when I talk about why the shadow self is an ally. So how does shadow relate to ego is the question. And so ego is our set of concepts and beliefs about who and what we are, right? And so it is our identification as a separate being. So when I say, if I say I am John, I'm a, shamanic teacher, I'm a dad, I'm a resident of, the state that I live in the US. And these are all things that I've kind of identified with. And I realize linguistically that's different in other languages. Like in French, you don't say I am John, you say I call myself John. But we still identify with, and these are labels and these are stories that we tell ourselves. Like I'm a dad isn't just a label. it's a set of stories I tell myself about, having children and spending time with them and whatever. So all of that, it's really is our um, self concept, right? Now, this is getting away from the Freudian idea of ego, and more into the spiritual aspect of ego. So we have this set of beliefs about ourselves, and was having this conversation with somebody the other day. One of those sets of beliefs is a really idealized set of beliefs. I'll give you personal example here. Like it is important to me, it is critical to me, to my self concept, that I am a quote unquote good person, right? What does that mean? It means that I'm more helpful than harmful. It means that I'm empathetic, that I have compassion, all of these things. That's part of my ego, right? And people will, a lot of spiritual teachers are like, oh, you have to kill the ego, you have to, destroy, go to battle with it. No, the ego is an ally too. But having an understanding of it and working with it and disidentifying from it, understanding like these are stories I tell about myself. I tell myself the story, I am a good person. Have I done things in my life that contradict that story that my ego wants to hang on to? Absolutely. Have I hurt other people? Absolutely. Hopefully not too much on purpose, but you know, have I made choices in my life that I regret? Absolutely, we all do, right? So the ego doesn't that cognitive dissonance, like I'm a good person, but I've also done things in my life that have harmed people, and that flies against my self-concept of being a good person. And so, you know, the I might hurl that, in some of that information back into the shadow. I might not even remember having harmed people. Or the other thing that happens pretty frequently when we're dealing with other people in our shadow is that we're projecting our inner junk onto them, the stuff that we don't want to, um, that we don't want to deal with in ourselves, because our ego's like, no, 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 no. You're a good person. You're a spiritual person. You're a calm person. You're a generous, compassionate, empathetic person. You're a generous person, but you forgot to tip that waiter. How horrible, right? And so that can, if the ego thinks that those kinds of things will chip away at our esteem, at our identity, right? It becomes an existential threat. Our identity is threatened there. Our ego is threatened. And the ego is a survival mechanism. The ego says this body and this mind are an individual, and this is what you are. You are this body and this mind, and all these stories that you tell about. This is what you are, which is not a spiritual truth. The spiritual truth is that you are this undying, incorruptible, slice of divinity. Um, or spark of divinity, if you don't like the word slice. Makes me think of pie. Now I'm hungry. Haven't had breakfast yet. Just drinking my coffee. So, ego, to answer your question, ego uses the shadow to protect itself. That's the shadow's function, is to protect the ego from damage, and to protect the ego from um, feeling emotions it doesn't want to feel. Um, and the there's a lie that happens in there somewhere that says, if we were to see the things, if we were to bring our shadow out into the light and embrace the shadow, our shadow self, right? If we were to embrace that and say, this is a part of me and it's an ally and whatever, that I am going to act out on horrible impulses, right? So an example I always give is, getting triggered, right? Somebody cuts me off in traffic and I want to chase them down and punch them in the nose. Now, I don't do that because A, I would get arrested, and B, my ego's like, you're a calm, spiritual, empathetic person who is nonviolent, right? But so feeling that impulse is very uncomfortable. There's cognitive dissonance there that flies in the face of my beliefs about myself. And so I push it down. My ego pushes that down into the shadow. But the problem is that impulse is coming from someplace with a good intention. And this is an important concept, an important idea to think about when we think about our shadow self being an ally, that all of these complexes, behaviors, and impulses that we have, whether we repress them or not, all have good intentions. The way they come up might not be the way that we want them to, and might not be something that we want to act upon, but there's a good intention behind it. So, an example, um, another sort of example is toddlers who, haven't put in the filters that we have as adults, having a temper tantrum, right? And they're like, "Wow, that's terrible behavior." Well, their behavior is not intended to be harmful to them. Their behavior is intended to get their needs met, right? To get their needs for attention or love or whatever it is that they're having a tantrum about met. That's what the tantrum is. So our shadow selves throw up these reactions and these behaviors to try to meet specific needs that we have. The need to feel respected, safe, to have esteem, all of these things. These are what our triggers are. Our triggers are pointers back to wounds. They're like breadcrumbs. And if you consider our wounds to be spiritual teachers, this is a phrase I stole from another practitioner. I'll give him credit. His first name is Kevin, and I can't remember his last name. But I told him someday I'll write a book called Breadcrumbs from the Teacher, and I will give you full credit for coming up with that phrase. So triggers are like breadcrumbs from the teacher being our wounds, our psychic wounds, which we all have. You didn't come through this world. I don't know of anybody who came into this world in a completely perfect environment and never had any trauma their entire life. Now, there's big T trauma and little T trauma, right? But we all go through traumas. We're all go through things. The other thing that forces stuff into our shadow that's really, really big is our culture. Now, whatever culture you happen to live in, um, culture is predominantly invisible to us. So, culture is the underlying set of values and rules of a group of people. And a lot of people will, I spent an entire semester in grad school debating about what culture is. And most people didn't get it, which was weird. But people were like, oh, culture is like the food and the clothes that you wear and the language that you use. No, those things are a reflection of culture. Those are artifacts, right? The culture is the actual set of rules and norms that lie underneath any group of people. So, we talk about office culture or company culture. A nation might have a culture, but there are also, you know, subcultures within that nature, within that country. And so our culture is like an invisible force that is placing pressure on us to conform to some idea of what's normal, right? Culture is a normalizing force. Why? Because humans are tribal. In order for us to survive as a species, we had to live in cohesive tribes that enforced norms, right? So that we could live together and get along together. Now, has that always worked out for us? Absolutely not, right? We have religious wars. We have religious war going on right now, right? Ethnic and religious wars going on where we're killing other people because they're different, because they don't conform to our culture, right? We've had, burning witches and heretics in Europe, in millions of people killed over this cultural stuff. So conforming to culture, we've been taught at a very unconscious level, is critical to our survival. And so there's a lot of pressure on us. So, for example, um, this is kind of a funny example, but I live in the state of Maine, and in the state, it was a surprise to me that this was the case. But it turns out that in the state of Maine, it is fully legal for women to walk around topless. It is not. Our indecent exposure law only covers the exposure of genitals, and breasts are not considered genitals. So I didn't know this, but that's the law. And there was, some years I found out because some years ago there was, some protest march or something where the women protested topless through the streets of Portland. It was shocking, like it was, to the whole culture, because the cultural norm is to cover up here. It's cold here most of the year. Summers are beautiful, but we don't have like I have never I've never seen a woman in public topless. You know, there may be there may be private beaches somewhere where people do that, or that's much more common. But women could go to the beach topless here, but they don't. Right? Why? Because that's our culture. That's the culture of this region. This region is very buttoned up. But if you were to go to lots of places in the Mediterranean, for example, most of the women on the beaches there would be topless. There would be a fair amount of people completely nude on the beach. So that they're again, so culture, why? Because that's the culture. It's much more open, it's less restrictive. Okay. So there's no legal thing that's going on here. It is purely cultural. And culture is, I don't, the way that culture enforces these things is I don't want to be judged. I don't want to be excluded from the culture. I don't want, and these days a culture can really come after you. I hate to use a right wing phrase, but cancel culture, right? Like you can be canceled for a single transgression. And not to say there aren't people who with horrible transgressions out there, that that are way outside, not just outside of societal norms, but they're actually harming people. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying you can transgress, and it can go completely viral these days. And so there's a lot of pressure by our culture to conform. So things that we do, desires that we have, beliefs that we may have, often are relegated to the shadow because they don't conform to our culture and it's dangerous to expose them. Um, Sexuality is one of those. And I don't just mean sexual orientation. It is, still not really mainstream to be polyamorous or to be into BDSM or to be a swinger or to, those things have come really, really far towards being considered in the normal range of sexuality. But they're still not very mainstream. And so, most people, the vast majority of people still hide that stuff. Um, we put a lot of rules around sex and sexuality. Um, and I've talked a little bit about that previously, and I will talk more. Um, I will talk more about the intersection of sex and spirituality in future lives and more videos and stuff. Oh, and I should mention that uh, we also this channel, so we me this channel also, now we have membership, which what that means is, there's a small monthly fee. It goes to support me in this channel doing this stuff. But also I'll be doing a lot of material, like as a thank you. There are perks, so there will be members only videos, which will be much more, is one of the perks. There's lots of perks, but members only videos. So there'll be videos that are for members only, and it'll include things like guided meditation. I try to make them short and more practical videos. So it'll be guided meditations or lessons in particular things. I'm thinking about doing a whole series on the runes, for example, if people are interested in rune work. it's an area of mine, and I might even do some members only live. Once there are enough members and if people want it, where I actually might do sessions live. So I might do what we call message sessions or mediumship sessions, where members can ask questions and get channeled answers. I almost don't like using the word channeled, but that's what it is. I don't have other language for it yet. Um, I'm learning Sev right now, um, also known as Sather or Scyther or Seth or Scythe, because it's pronounced differently in different languages, which is a form of, I would call it Norse shamanism, but it's more akin to mediumship. And so I'll be looking for opportunities to practice that with you all. But that would probably be a members only live broadcast. Anyway, so that's on YouTube. If you're on other channels, you would have to go over to YouTube to become a member. But okay, enough about that. Enough of the pitch. I don't like selling stuff too much. Um, so if that interests you, you can join or find out more information about that on my YouTube channel. So going back to like a lot of our sexual desires and things are in our shadow. And like if you're in an intimate relationship with somebody, one of the most powerful experiences I've had with intimate partners is to sit with them completely non-judgmentally and ask, tell me what what's an unfulfilled fantasy that you have that you haven't shared with me, even if it's something that for whatever reason you would never do, or you think that I would never do, or whatever. Just, we can just talk about it, right? And it's not the idea of, hey, let's get off on each other's fantasies. It's the idea that I'm going to allow you to express the fullness of who you are, including these sort of hidden sexual desires that I want to make you feel safe with me, safe enough to share. I am not going to judge you, even if it's like, oh, I want to do this and that and hang from a tree and have, uh behead somebody, whatever, no violent stuff, hopefully, but whatever it is, right? Even if it was something that's shocking to me, I'm not going to judge that person for that, because we all have that stuff. I don't care who you are. I don't care how pure you think you are. Your ego wants to make you think you are. We all have that stuff. And so sitting with somebody non-judgmentally and just saying, okay, that's really interesting. Tell me more about that. What is exciting about that? That is a very healing exercise. Okay, it's beyond the, again, we're getting off on each other's fantasies aspect, and it is, I am accepting the totality of you, even the parts of you that you feel like you've had to hide away with others. I'm allowing you to bring those out into the light and show them. So the topic for I've talked a lot about the shadow. I've talked about the shadow and the ego and culture's effect on the shadow. But the topic for today is why the shadow self is an ally and not an enemy, and why it's important in your spiritual evolution, in your psycho spiritual work, in your movement towards enlightenment or gnosis or whatever. I prefer the word gnosis to enlightenment, but um, in your movement towards fullness of being, why is it important to treat our shadow as an ally? Well, one of the reasons comes from Jung, who said, that which we resist persists. So if I'm fighting off this part of myself that I don't want to see it, I'm going to push it down, I'm going to fight with it. It's my enemy. These are parts of me that I hate, whatever. This keeps that structure in place and does not allow me to heal the wounded parts or or explore the depths of who I am, any of those things. So the shift in paradigm to this is an ally, it has a positive intention. And I talked about toddlers having tantrums. The tantrum is bad behavior, but the intention behind the behavior is positive. And the same thing is true for your shadow. When things come up, when you get triggered, for example, the intention might be protective, right? You might have had a wound. Oh, this reminds me of that wound that I can't really remember because it was traumatic. And I'm going to throw up some anger to make sure that that never happens to me again, or nothing like that ever happens to me again. That's one of the functions of the shadow. The shadow also um, is an adaptive protective mechanism to hide, so we don't have to constantly have our trauma thrown in front of us, right? So the wounds that are held there. Um, and I firmly believe, and this is absolutely true in my experience, that we don't have to remember our traumas to heal from them, but we have to recognize that they're there. We have to recognize that there are wounds that are there that we are healing from, that it's part of our process to heal from these wounds. Right. Part of our spiritual evolution is to do what we can to heal these wounds that we got, in childhood or whenever, or even ancestral wounding. So as a shamanic healer, I do a lot of ancestral work and even stuff from past lives, right? There's stuff that we carry with us. So it's our job to work on that stuff. And so the shadow is an ally in that it's trying to protect us. It's doing its best to keep the socially unacceptable stuff away from us and whatever. But it is overzealous, meaning, you know, if I have this desire to, somebody cuts me off in traffic, to punch them in the nose, and that's coming from somewhere, the shadow and the ego are going to tell me that, oh, if you were to be fully aware of where that came from, you would just run around punching everybody in the nose, right? You would lose control of yourself because you wouldn't have this self concept of being a good person, a good non-violent person who doesn't punch people in the nose. And that's not true. That's actually a lie that our ego tells us, that says you are not safe without me. You are not safe to look at these aspects of yourself. Um, if that comes up, that anger comes up, that addressing that wound does not mean that I am suddenly going to be out of control. Quite the opposite. It's the fact that stuff is coming up out of our shadow, so we're not aware of it. That's the problem. That we react to something without being able to think about it. When we start to treat our shadow as an ally and examine what's in there, we have more choices about our behavior. Oh, that made me angry. I might have felt an impulse to, punch that person in the nose. But I'm not going to do that because logically I know that's the wrong thing to do. You still have a discerning brain. You're not a toddler. Anyway, I'm assuming you're not a toddler if you're watching this video. Um, you are not a toddler. And so you have learned things. You have learned about ethical behavior. You have learned about what your values are. Even if parts of you don't necessarily share those values, you can come to an agreement with them. So an example of that might be, going back to the sexual desire thing, I'm in a committed monogamous relationship with my girlfriend, and if I had a desire to something comes up, I'm attracted to that woman over there. Um, just because I recognize that, I have can find other women attractive, or whatever, and even it might stir certain desires and whatever. I'm not going to act on that, right? Because I know that would hurt my partner. I know that it's not in my value system, and I know that would hurt my partner, and so I'm not going to do that, right? The problem comes from when we make having the desire mean that we are awful human beings, right? Um, when the whole unclean thoughts thing, right? Unclean thoughts being a sin. You can sin just by thinking about something. Um, and so people push that stuff, and the people telling us that unclean thoughts are sinful, um, you know, don't have a really good record of behavior towards other human beings, right? You know, and particularly with sexual transgression against minors and things like that, with sexual abuse, not a really good record there. So, you know, it's not a problem having a thought. Thoughts are not, we are not our thoughts. Okay. We have a thought and go, oh, that person, I'm going to go punch him in the nose. That is not the same thing as going and punching that person in the nose. Because if we have this thought and we're aware of it and say, oh my gosh, I would never do that because I have ethics, I have values, I know that that's the wrong thing to do. And I know that I could get into trouble if I did it because it's also not, my culture says that's so bad assaulting somebody else that they're actually going to lock me up in jail if I do that. I know all these things. I'm not going to do it. But what happens is if I start to bring the wounding out into the light, like what's the source of that? What's the source of my hidden desires? What's the source um of my wounding? I can start to heal that, but I can't heal it until I'm aware of it. And just becoming aware that something's there begins the healing process. Um, if that's all you ever did was start to become aware of your shadow material, you would progress. You would make lots and lots of progress spiritually. So, um, let me talk again about hidden desires. And I don't, I've talked a lot about sex here. I promise I don't have sex on the brain at the moment. Sometimes I do, but not at the moment. Um, Hidden desires can be not just sexual things too, right? So maybe I've always had the desire to uh, sing or play the piano or something, and my parents growing up were like, "Oh, you can't even carry a tune in a bucket, and you'll never be good at that." And nobody in our family is musical, and blah blah blah. So all these messages were coming through, or even musicians are all drug addicts and what promiscuous and whatever. So there's this like moral judgment about that, and there's this value judgment about that, and there's this ethical judgment about that, right? So then I repress my desire to express myself through music, and or whatever it is, right? So I repress some desire that I've had. Well, it's still there. It still wants to, it still wants to come out. I'm not the best singer in the world, but I've never let that stop me. um, I also think people fear people fear judgment so much. It's why public speaking is a number one fear of people, right? We fear the judgment of others, even if we have no idea what that judgment will be. This is Phoebe. If you haven't seen her in previous videos, she always does like to make an appearance and then use me as furniture to get to her cat condos back there with some food in it. Um, where is it? Uh, so there are lots of desires that may be in here, right? And they can be very specific, like I've always wanted to play the piano, or whatever. And they can be really, really abstract as well. Like um, I have this desire for freedom, this personal freedom, and what does that mean for me? And I hate to be tied down to things. And where does that come from? And that can come from wounding, for one thing, right? Like people who may have come from not having really great attachment, really solid secure attachment with parents, might fear relationships, for example, and feel like it's an aspect of their freedom not getting into committed relationships, right? Because they didn't have that as a nurturing example early in their life. But by examining that, where does my desire for freedom come from? Where does my desire to play piano or sing or speak on stage or whatever. Where does that come from? Why am I afraid of that? Right. So we can have these conflicting things going on that are holding things in our shadow. So, on a practical level, I would, here's my, here's the practical advice section of this video. Start to document this stuff, right? Write it down. If journal what's going on with you, journal stuff that comes up for you, journal your definitely keep a triggers journal. This is an assignment a shamanic teacher gave me years back. We were required to keep a trigger journal for a month. Every time we something triggered us, we had an overwhelming emotional response seemingly out of nowhere. We were to write it down. So write down the date and time, what happened, and what your response was to that, and then go back through that sometime later, revisit that. Where does this come from? There's a pattern here. Every time this, stimulus happens, this is the trigger response. Where does that come from? And that will point to some wounding that is held in your shadow. And again, you don't have to remember the incident. You just have to know that there's a wound there. What's this wound about? Why is it that? So I'll give you one. I'll give you one of mine. I'll give you a big one of mine that I'm still probably cleaning up, and I don't know the origin story of this. Um, but it triggers me when people treat me like I'm stupid, right? And so I know that's a violation of of my ego, for one, because I choose to think of myself as a smart and educated person. So when somebody talks to me or treats me like I'm not, um, that has been very triggering for me in the past. It's something I've worked on. It's something I continue to work on. If somebody is people who are entitled bother me. So another indication of what's in our shadow is things that bother me about other people, right? Things that drive me crazy, pet peeves about other people, frequently are me projecting something onto that person. So people who act entitled really bother me, right? And I mean entitled to things they're not entitled to, especially when it's towards me. Um, and so, that has to do with I know exactly what that has to do. That has to do with my upbringing and being told, being taught never to expect anything, and that I wasn't worthy, and I wanted to feel, but I deserve this, but I want that, but so I wanted to be entitled to those things and never was, so I pushed it back. So then I'm projecting this wounding about being entitlement onto other people. Another thing that my came from my upbringing, my one side of my family, um you know my dad's side of the family, he grew up pretty poor, and in fact they lived in a chicken coop for a year, I think, or so, and literally with chickens, and ate nothing but chicken that they raised themselves for an entire year. To this day, my father won't eat chicken, which I can completely understand if I were forced to eat the same thing every day for an entire year or however long it was. Um, and so, the concept that I'm a good person, but I'm poor and doesn't fit in with the social justice of good people get good things. Hardworking people, my father's family, incredibly hardworking people. Um, Hardworking doesn't mean you succeed. It really doesn't. The hardest working people in the world are not the most financially successful people in the world. There's nothing wrong with hard work, and but the way we virtualize hard work in this culture, in the culture I came from, people work themselves to death and never reap the many benefits from it. So the idea was, they're poor, they work very hard, they consider themselves good people. They were, ethical people, compassionate people, give you the shirt off their back, salt of the earth kind of people, my dad's family. Um, but never really had any financial success. And so there is this idea, and it would be actually spoken, oh, rich people, you know how they are, right? And there was this idea, sort of like, anybody who is wealthy or has any sort of financial success, it can only be doing that by being bad people, because we're good people, but we're poor. So they have to be crooked or stealing from people or unethical. Um, and it's interesting. It's interesting to examine the way that that has worked its way out in my in my life, um, and uh, and knowing like where that comes from. Right, knowing, that aspect of myself is somewhat hidden away, and having, feeling guilty about having financial success might be locked away in there. So, if I want to be financially successful and have a more comfortable life, these are things I need to address. So, even though the shadow is an ally, it's doing this to, it's kept these values, these beliefs, these things, um, hidden away so that I act in accordance, that I'm accepted by my family, that I'm reflecting the tribal values, all of these things. It's not serving me, right? It's not serving me in the way that I want it to. I don't want to financially struggle. That's hard. It's hard in this world. We don't live in a world that makes life easy for people who are financially struggling. Um, and I've been super poor at points in my life, like getting evicted from my apartment and not having enough money to eat poor, in my life. And I've been at times comfortable, and I've never been wealthy or rich or anything. But, when I look at all of the things that I've gone through sort of with finances and stuff, I can tie that directly to this belief system that was set up by my family. So, one of the things you can do besides journaling, and you can journal this too as well, is look at what are the values of my family of origin? What are the things they told me? I'm a fan of the founder of Mind Valley, Vishen Lakhiani, and he has this term he calls BRULES, BRULES, which stands for bullshit rules. Pardon my French. In These are rules that are placed on us by society, culture, our parents, education, whatever, that really don't make any sense. Like, um, rules like, if you're, I guess this is a belief, but a belief is a type of rule. Belief is a rule about what is true or not. If you're financially successful, you're a crook, you're a bad person. Well, that's a dumb rule. I mean, that's not true. There are lots of people who are financially successful who are good people. Um, I worked for a company years ago, that was run by one of the wealthiest people in the world, that almost nobody, like, his name was not an everyday thing. He's not like an Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos or whatever, or Bill Gates. But this guy was one of the wealthiest human beings on the planet. And I don't know that you would see him in Forbes or anything, because he wasn't about the public image. And he did a lot of huge charitable works that he never put his name on, right? And I only know about it because I knew people who worked for the division of the company that were in part responsible for some of the charitable works that he did. Was really, really ethical, really, really good to the people that worked for him. I knew his uh, some of his protection details, so some of the security guards he had that helped keep him safe. Um, they would honestly take a bullet for that guy, and not just because it was their job. It was because he was so good to them. Contrast that to, I'll just say, a former Secretary of Defense, and I used to teach martial arts, and I did some training for the bodyguard. I trained the bodyguards. I want to say training. I did 2 days of training for the body, the MP detachment that was the bodyguards for the Secretary of Defense, and they would have taken a bullet for the guy, but they hated him, and they're like, "We're not supposed to tell you this, but the guy's an asshole," right? Um, so I won't tell you which one because I don't want to get anybody in trouble. But this was some time ago. This was many years ago, and um, so yeah, there's no necessarily correspondence there, but that was an artificial rule that was created by my family, or not created by my family, but definitely espoused by my family, and even going back to, I grew up, my many of my ancestors, or a number of my ancestors, came over on the Mayflower, so they were Puritans, they were Calvinists. So things like pleasure and fun and that sort of thing were seen as sinful. Well, that cultural norm still runs through much of the culture in the area where I live. It's why if you go from here, you go to California, for example, which is 3,000 miles away, if you don't know US geography, the culture there is hugely different, right? There's more of a there's more of a mix, first of all, of people from different places. Right, where I live in Maine is not very diverse, so you have more of a diversity of ideas and values and things coming in, and you had a lot of people traveling out there to sort of make their own way. um, and you have the entertainment industry out there and all kinds of other stuff. So very, very different than the culture here. Things are very buttoned up here, so anything that is pleasurable, right? um, uh, the Puritans, I don't know if a lot of people knew this, um, in Boston, for example, banned Christmas for years. I think something like 9 years. The celebration of Christmas was outlawed because it was too much. People were having too much fun. They were drinking too much. You don't want to have fun or drink too much. One of my ancestors was booted from his colony because he was caught playing cards. Right? How evil. Um, so there is this thing here that pleasure is sinful and pain comes from this Calvinist background. Pain and hard work and toil is what gets you into heaven, right? Your reward is when you die. You should not be living a happy life now. You got to die to live a good life, right? And so that is a cultural force that forces a lot of, like, oh, well, if I want to have pleasurable sex, for example, and creative sex, and all of these things, like, that would make me a bad person, and that would make me sinful. That would make me, sex outside of marriage, God forbid, right? Um, there are writings about, beyond the Scarlet Letter. I know that the Scarlet Letter is fiction, but there are writings about pilgrims coming upon wives, in being caught with somebody other than their husbands and stuff like that. I have to think, like, that stuff was going on even back then. But uh you know that stuff gets pushed away, even though you know sexuality, from a shamanic perspective, from my shamanic perspective, is a vital part of our life force, a vital part of our connection to the natural world, a vital part of our connection to divinity. I've done talks about this. I'll do more. I'll probably do some stuff. I'll do some stuff in the members only channel about sex and spirituality as well. Um, that may not be just for completely for public consumption, but um, I've talked a lot about this, and how this. So we're repressing our natural desires, and I don't mean like everybody needs to be promiscuous or anything like that. I'm not saying anybody needs to be anything. There are people who are asexual, and that's totally fine. Anything. I'm very sex positive. Anything between consenting adults is fine. That's my that's my take on it. Just don't hurt anybody, and have active, positive, sane consent about things, and then do what thou wilt. But yeah, so there are, so in, in this repression comes all kinds of problems, right? It comes frustrations in relationships. For example, if I can't express myself openly to my partner and say, say what I want or what makes me happy, or it creates this tension, and resentment, this dissatisfaction in the relationship potentially. So there are all kinds of things going on. But again, the reason I call the shadow self an ally is it's because it's trying to protect us. It's trying to keep us safe. It's trying to keep our ego safe in the culture that we live in, and also protect us from the re-experiencing the psycho spiritual wounds that we have. My voice is going a little bit. I don't know if you can hear that. I'm gonna have another little sip of coffee here. I am drinking Green Mountain Coffee Roasters Nantucket blend at this moment, which I've been drinking pretty much steadily for until I run out of it, and then we have we have backup coffee, um, which is coffee that's not as good, but will do in a pinch. I'm not really a coffee snob too much, but I do love my coffee, and um, so coffee is a little bit of a ritual for me. So, what do we do? What do we do about this, and why is it important to see the shadow as an ally, particularly if we're doing spiritual work, if we're doing any kind of spiritual development? Now, I'm going to say something that might seem, if you're not on a spiritual path or you've never been with a spiritual teacher in you close up or whatever. Um, I have met people. I've met spiritual teachers. I had a spiritual teacher back when I was in college a million years ago. Um, that had abilities, that had paranormal abilities. They had such a high level of spiritual development that they could do things that seemed very supernatural. The way that they could, you could say, oh well, you were just hallucinating, or they were doing trickery, or whatever. Um, there was definitely altering of consciousness happening, not with drugs or anything, just altering, just the way that this person could meditate with you would shift your consciousness so you could experience these things. Um, and that person wound up taking his own life. So why is that? And this is why I think it's critical to do your shadow work, to do your alchemy, which is to transmute your shadow material into gold. Um, because you can do spiritual development work, you can do awakening work, right? You can awaken to spirit, you can build your energy body up and have really, really powerful stuff happen. I had a martial arts teacher one time who had clearly been doing a lot of energy work, and like um touched me with his palm, just kind of, pop, little pop like this, and like my chest collapsed, and I flew backwards and slammed into the wall behind me, and just pop, and it was no pain here, right? It wasn't like he had struck me really hard, just a touch, and it like went through my whole body and slung me into the back wall. You can do that kind of energy work, that kind of energy development. It takes years to develop, but martial artists do that and stuff. You can do that sort of energy work. You can develop, you can have Kundalini rise up and develop the different powers associated with the chakras, all of these things without doing your shadow work. And if you don't do your shadow work and you reach these levels of spiritual development, you become a person who is a danger to others and to yourself. This is why I think it's critical. Um, so you'll see very revered spiritual teachers sometimes who wind up abusing their followers and their students. Lots of gurus with lots of stories of abuse, sexual abuse, financial abuse, theft, all kinds of stuff. Or people will become self-destructive. There are revered spiritual teachers who have, taken their own lives. You think about I don't know how much spiritual development they've done, but these like suicide cults, right, that are out there. Uh, you've got, but people will turn it inwards, and I spiritual teachers who've drank themselves to death, or again, like started these cults where people, they were, you know basically taking financial and sexual advantage of people. So you have to it's critical. I almost never say you have to or you should. I'll say it's critical to, on your spiritual path, to do shadow work, to do your own shadow work. You can go to a healer to help you with shadow work. You can go to somebody to walk you through shadow work. You can go through psychoanalysis, psychotherapy. Talk therapy can work for this as well. But nothing's quite as powerful as doing your own work, because you have instantaneous access to the material in your consciousness. This isn't to say you will have access to the material that is in your unconscious, at least not conscious. So, oh, thank you so much. I appreciate that, and to you as well. Um, so yeah, so thank you for stopping by this morning. I appreciate it, and I appreciate everybody who stops by, whether you comment or not. I appreciate you being here. Um, I don't like talking to my. I mean, I do a lot of videos where they aren't live, and I'm sort of talking to myself, but I'm talking to you. We're having a conversation. Um, uh, and it's a little bit of outreach for me as well. So, where are we? Let me see. They've moved things around on my interface. Oh, there we go. So I've been talking for about an hour. That's sort of my limit. Before I realize that I'm rambling. I've probably been rambling anyway. Um, but hopefully I've done, in this video, I've, described a little bit of the shadow, where it comes from, why we need to work with it, and why we should treat it as an ally and not as an enemy. We don't want to be fighting ourselves. We want to be loving ourselves. And here's a secret: love is acceptance, love is allowing, right? I allow you to be just as you are, right? I remember one of the things I said to my girlfriend when, in the beginning when we started dating. Oh, thank you. You as well. Yeah, we are going into the weekend. And I have a very busy weekend ahead. I'm doing an in-home session tomorrow with somebody where I'm doing a house clearing, which is something I do from time to time, but also a healing session. So it's going to be a long outing. And then I've got students on Sunday, and I think Monday. So for the near future, I'm fairly busy. Busy weekend. Never really a day off for me, but that's okay. Um, I forgot where I was. Oh, you have. Oh, interesting. Interesting. Were you born in the Brunswick area, or oh my gosh. Yeah, so interesting. I'll go on a tangent for a second. When I first came into shamanism, I was like, oh man, how am I going to find a teacher? I live in Maine. And as it turns out, Maine has a very for its population. Maine is one of the least populated states in the whole country. Most of the state is forest, so there's not a big population here. There's a huge shamanic community here. There are a huge amount of people. Um, a lot of people just practice on their own and don't, see clients or teach. Um, in fact, the vast majority of people don't. But there are really amazing shamanic teachers here. There are really amazing shamanic practitioners here, which is great because I have a pretty good referral network. Yeah. Okay. So up in Loring, yeah, that's up there. Um, yeah. So Loring is not open anymore, as neither is Brunswick. I don't know that we have any active military bases anymore, but yeah, Loring was a big part of the Cold War. That was, we operated Air Force. There's an Air Force base up there, so Limestone. Now they're big. They're often like big concerts up in Limestone and stuff, which has always seemed interesting to me because it's so far away from southern Maine. Oh, okay. Yeah. So, yeah, so there's lots going on here shamanically. My teacher, who is now retired from teaching, was up here, lived up here her whole life. There's another well-known teacher and shamanic author, Evelyn Reistick. I think that's how you pronounce her last name. I've met her. We're social media friends, and I've met her once, and seems very lovely woman, and is a teacher and has authored a ton of books on shamanism, including Norse shamanism, which is a particular interest of mine, and I own several of her books. Um, and there are others. There are others that practice up here. Not all completely well known, but there's a big shamanic community here. So I've been to I've been to pretty large shamanic drum circles and things, and um, you know so, yeah, if you get a chance to visit up here, you could potentially find some shamanic activity happening. So, anyway, I'm gonna leave you for today. It's been, an hour and 5 minutes that I've been talking, and I need to save my voice a little bit for clients and students. But I'll leave you with this. I love you all. I mean that. And that means I accept you just as you are, just as the way you're showing up. You are whole. You are complete. You are loved. You are all divine at your core and worthy of worship. And I hope to see you again soon. Don't forget, if you are interested in attending these in future, subscribe to my channel. You can also join the channel, and you'll have access to members only stuff. And if I get enough members, we'll do some members only lives. With that, I will leave you. Hope you all enjoy your weekend, and